when a forgotten mail-order bride stepped off the train into the dust of Bitter Creek, she expected a husband. Instead, she found a bullet-riddled stranger bleeding out on a cabin floor. She risked everything to save his life, completely unaware she was nursing the most powerful, ruthless man in Wyoming. The Union Pacific locomotive hissed violently, belching a thick cloud of black coal smoke before screeching away from the solitary wooden platform of Bitter Creek, Wyoming. The year was 1888, and the western wind carried nothing but grit and the bitter scent of sagebrush. Clara Higgins stood entirely alone, her gloved hands tightly gripping the handle of a battered leather trunk. She was 24, a woman whose delicate features masked a spine forged from New England steel. She had traveled over 1,000 miles from a cramped boarding house in Boston, clutching a letter from a man named Hiram Croft. The letter had promised marriage, a sprawling ranch, and a life of dignified stability. But as the dust settled, the platform remained empty. There was no Hiram Croft. After an hour of standing in the relentless sun, Clara dragged her trunk toward the small telegraph office. The station master, a grizzled man named Elias Cobb with tobacco stains on his chin, barely looked up from his ledger. "Looking for Croft?" Cobb asked, his voice like grinding rocks. "You're about 2 weeks too late, missy." Hiram Croft packed up his wagon and headed for California. Ran off with a saloon girl from Cheyenne. Owed half the town money, too. Clara felt the ground tilt beneath her boots. Her breath caught in her throat. She'd spent her last $3 on the train ticket. She had no family to return to, no money for a return fare, and now no husband. The shame of being an abandoned mail-order bride was a heavy, suffocating cloak. But the immediate reality was far more terrifying. She was a woman stranded in a ruthless frontier town. "Is there a boarding house?" she asked, fighting to keep her voice steady. Cobb snorted. "Not one suitable for a lady. The next train east ain't for 5 days. There's an old homesteader's shack about a mile out, up past the ridge, the Miller place. It's abandoned, but the roof mostly holds. You can wait there, provided you don't mind the draft." With no other choice, Clara dragged her heavy trunk through the dust, ignoring the leering stares of ranch hands passing by on horseback. The Miller shack was exactly as Cobb described, a dilapidated, wind-beaten wooden box sitting desolate against the vast Wyoming horizon. Inside, it smelled of dry rot and old earth. By nightfall, a violent spring storm rolled over the plains. Thunder cracked like artillery fire, shaking the flimsy walls of the cabin. Clara huddled by the small stone hearth, having managed to build a meager fire with broken chair legs. She was crying, though she would never admit it, mourning the death of her dreams. Then she heard it, a heavy, wet thud against the wooden door. Clara froze, her heart hammering against her ribs. Outlaws and drunks roamed these parts. She reached into her trunk, her fingers closing around the cold, heavy iron of her late father's Colt revolver. She crept toward the door. Another thud, followed by a low, agonizing groan. Gathering her courage, she unlatched the door. A heavy weight instantly collapsed against her, driving her to the floorboards. It was a man. He was soaked to the bone, covered in thick, dark mud, and shivering violently. As Clara pushed him over, the firelight illuminated a terrifying sight. His heavy canvas duster was soaked in blood. A gaping, ragged bullet hole sat just below his right ribs, pulsing with a fresh crimson flow. "Help," he rasped, his voice barely a whisper before his eyes rolled back and he lost consciousness. Clara's father had been a battlefield surgeon during the Civil War. Though she had never officially practiced, she had assisted him for years, absorbing his knowledge out of necessity. The sight of blood didn't paralyze her. It activated a deeply ingrained instinct. She dragged the massive man toward the fire. He was remarkably heavy, built with the dense, layered muscle of a man who worked the land. Yet his boots, though ruined by mud, were made of fine Spanish leather. She didn't have time to ponder the contradiction. Working feverishly, Clara tore the hem of her only clean cotton petticoat into long strips. She found a tin pot, filled it with rainwater from a barrel outside, and set it over the fire to boil. She unbuttoned his shirt, revealing a broad, scarred chest and the ugly, bubbling entry wound of a large caliber bullet. "Hold on, mister," she whispered, her hands trembling as she wiped the blood away. "Just hold on." Using a small pair of surgical forceps from her father's kit, she probed the wound. The man thrashed in his unconscious state, crying out in agony. Clara straddled his hips to pin him down, gritting her teeth as she dug for the lead. It felt like hours, the storm raging outside mirroring the desperate battle inside the cabin. Finally, the forceps clicked against metal. With a sharp tug, she pulled out a deformed chunk of lead. She poured a generous splash of the strong carbolic acid over the wound, ignoring the sickening sizzle, and bound him tightly with the petticoat strips. Exhausted, covered in a stranger's blood, Clara collapsed against the wall and watched his chest rise and fall. She had saved him, but she had no idea who she had just tethered her fate to. For 3 days and 3 nights, the stranger burned with a violent fever. Clara didn't sleep. She sat by his side, pressing cool, wet cloths to his forehead and forcing drops of water past his cracked lips. In his delirium, the man fought invisible demons. He thrashed and cursed, his voice a low, gravelly growl. He muttered names she didn't know. "Rourke, you treacherous dog," he gasped one night, his hand shooting out to grip her wrist with bruising force. "The deed. They burned the deed." Clara gently pried his fingers away. "Hush now, you're safe." She assumed he was a ranch hand, a drifter who had found himself on the wrong end of a poker game or crossed a gang of cattle rustlers. The West was full of violent men and violent ends. On the morning of the 4th day, the fever broke. Clara was sweeping the dusty floor when she heard a dry rustle of fabric. She turned to find the stranger awake. His eyes were startlingly clear, a piercing, intelligent shade of storm cloud gray. He was looking at her with the calculating intensity of a predator assessing its surroundings. "Where am I?" he asked, his voice raspy but surprisingly commanding. "You're in the old Miller shack, just outside Bitter Creek," Clara replied, keeping her distance. "You stumbled in here 4 nights ago with a bullet in your gut. You nearly died." The man touched his side, feeling the tight bandages. He looked around the squalid cabin, then back at Clara. He noticed her refined posture, her clean but simple dress, and the utter lack of fear in her eyes. "You pulled the lead out?" he asked. "My father was a surgeon. I did what I had to do." Clara wiped her hands on her apron. "Who shot you?" The man hesitated. A shadow crossed his face, a sudden dark realization. He looked down at his own hands, then back at her. "Ambush," he lied smoothly. "Drifters on the trail. Wanted my horse." "And your name?" He held her gaze for a fraction of a second, too long. "John. Just John." "Well, just John. I am Clara Higgins, and you owe me a new petticoat." A faint, rusty chuckle escaped his lips before he winced in pain. Wyatt Callahan, known from Denver to Cheyenne as the ruthless, untouchable baron of the Callahan Cattle Company, had never been treated with such casual disregard. Men trembled when he walked into a room. Politicians took his bribes and sheriffs looked the other way. But to this woman, he was just a bleeding nuisance. Over the next 2 days, Wyatt played the part of the destitute drifter. He needed time. His own foreman, Jedediah Rourke, had orchestrated the ambush. Rourke had grown greedy, wanting the vast Callahan empire for himself. Wyatt knew that if he walked into Bitter Creek now, wounded and weak, Rourke's men would finish the job. He had to heal, and he had to trust this fierce, mysterious woman. By the end of the week, Clara's meager supplies had run completely dry. "I have to go into town," Clara announced one morning, tying her bonnet. "We are out of beans, and you need more bandages." "Clara, don't," Wyatt said from the cot, genuine concern in his voice. "Town is dangerous. You don't know the men who run it." "I am a grown woman, John. I survived Boston's winters and a cross-country train ride. I can survive a trip to the general store." Wyatt watched her go, a knot of anxiety forming in his chest. Bitter Creek, in the daylight, was a harsh, ugly place. The streets were choked with dust, and the saloons were already loud with the shouts of rowdy cowboys. Clara walked with her head held high, ignoring the catcalls, and pushed open the door to O'Malley's general store. Arthur O'Malley, a balding, nervous man, stood behind the counter. Clara placed a small silver locket, her mother's, on the glass. "I need flour, beans, a tin of coffee, and clean cotton," Clara said firmly. "Will this cover it?" O'Malley picked up the locket, sighing. "It's worth more than the groceries, miss, but I can't give you cash for the difference. The bank ain't lending, and the Callahan Company is squeezing every dime out of this town." "The Callahan Company?" Clara asked, recalling the name on a large sign above the bank. Before O'Malley could answer, the store door banged open. The sunlight was blocked by a massive, ugly man wearing silver spurs and a sneer. He was flanked by 2 armed thugs. "O'Malley," the man bellowed, "rent is due on the building, and the boss says the rate just went up 20%. O'Malley visibly trembled. "Mr. Rourke, please. The stagecoach hasn't come through in weeks. I don't have it." Jedediah Rourke drew his revolver with blinding speed and smashed the heavy barrel into a glass display case, shattering it into 100 pieces. Clara flinched but stood her ground. "Callahan don't care about your excuses, O'Malley," Rourke spat. "He owns the building, he owns the dirt it sits on, and he owns you. Have the money by tomorrow or we burn it down." Rourke turned to leave, his eyes finally landing on Clara. He paused, a greasy smile spreading across his face. "Well, well, ain't you a pretty little bird to be flying in this dust bowl? Who do you belong to?" "I belong to myself, sir," Clara said, her voice dripping with venomous, polite restraint. "And I suggest you mind your manners before you break anything else you can't afford to fix." Rourke laughed, a harsh, barking sound. "Feisty. The boss would like you. Too bad for you. Wyatt Callahan is probably rotting in a ditch somewhere, though we haven't found the body yet. Means I'm in charge now." He tipped his hat mockingly and strode out, his men laughing behind him. Clara gathered her supplies, her heart racing. She hurried back to the Miller shack, the oppressive heat of the sun beating down on her. When she walked through the door, John was sitting up, a makeshift crutch carved from a fence post under his arm. "You're pale," he noted instantly, his eyes narrowing. "What happened?" Clara dropped the sacks on the table, her hands shaking as she finally let the adrenaline crash. "This town is run by monsters," she breathed, pouring a cup of water. "I went to the store. A man named Rourke came in. He smashed the place to pieces, demanding money. Wyatt's jaw tightened. Rourke? Yes. He claimed he works for a man named Wyatt Callahan. From what O'Malley says, this Callahan is a tyrant. He owns the whole town, crushes the poor, and rules by fear. A coward who hides behind thugs like Rourke. Clara looked at John, her eyes blazing with righteous anger. If I ever met this Wyatt Callahan, I think I would shoot him myself. Wyatt sat perfectly still. The silence in the cabin was suddenly deafening. He looked at the woman who had saved his life, the woman who had traded her mother's heirloom to feed him. She despised everything he represented. She despised him. "Is that so?" Wyatt asked softly, the irony tasting like ash in his mouth. "Men like that are a plague on the earth," Clara said, beginning to sort the groceries. But Rourke said something odd. He said Callahan might be dead in a ditch. So perhaps the devil has finally called his servant home. Wyatt looked down at the bandages she had wrapped around him. For the first time in his 35 years of ruthless ambition, the great Wyatt Callahan felt a crushing weight of shame. He was the devil she spoke of. And he realized, with a sudden, terrifying clarity, that he was falling in love with her. "Maybe he has," Wyatt murmured, staring into the flickering fire. "Maybe the old Callahan is dead." For 3 agonizing weeks, the dilapidated Miller shack became a crucible of quiet transformation. The bitter Wyoming spring slowly gave way to the baking heat of early summer, and inside the cabin, the man Clara knew only as John steadily regained his strength. Their days fell into a domestic rhythm that Wyatt Callahan found entirely alien. He was a man who had built his cattle empire through sheer force of will, surviving the devastating Big Die-Up blizzard of '86 that had bankrupted lesser men, and rubbing shoulders with real cutthroat cattle kings like John Clay and Cheyenne. He had always taken what he wanted. Yet here he was, sitting on a rickety wooden chair, peeling potatoes while a destitute mail-order bride lectured him on the philosophy of human decency. Clara read to him in the evenings from a battered Bible and a volume of Emerson she had packed in her trunk. She spoke of her father's belief that a man's worth was measured not by the land he owned, but by the suffering he alleviated. Every word she spoke was an unwritten indictment of Wyatt's entire existence. He had spent 10 years crushing homesteaders, bribing marshals, and bleeding towns like Bitter Creek Dry to line his own pockets. He was falling deeply, irrevocably in love with her. He watched the way the firelight caught the auburn strands of her hair, the fierce, unyielding set of her jaw, and the gentle way her hands, calloused from hard work, changed his bandages. But a cold knot of dread sat heavily in his stomach. He was living on borrowed time. The reckoning arrived on a sweltering Tuesday afternoon. Clara was outside by the rain barrel, scrubbing laundry, while Wyatt sat by the window, cleaning her father's Colt revolver. His ribs still ached with a dull, throbbing intensity. But the fever was long gone, and his reflexes had returned. The low, rhythmic thud of approaching hooves broke the prairie silence. Wyatt's head snapped up. 2 riders were cresting the ridge, moving fast. Even from a distance, he recognized the slouching posture of Silas and the heavy-set frame of Dutch, 2 of Jedediah Rourke's most vicious enforcers. They had likely been scouring the outskirts of town for his body. "Clara!" Wyatt barked, his voice sharp and commanding. "Get inside, now!" Startled by the raw authority in his tone, Clara dropped a wet shirt and hurried into the cabin. Wyatt slammed the heavy wooden door shut and threw the iron bolt. He shoved Clara behind the stone hearth. "John, what is it?" she whispered, her eyes wide with sudden terror. Is it drifters? Stay down. Do not make a sound, Wyatt ordered, his storm gray eyes cold and calculating. He thumbed the hammer of the colt back. Outside, the horses nickered as they were pulled to a halt. Heavy boots crunched on the dry dirt. Well, well, a raspy voice called out. It was Silas. Look at this, Dutch. Somebody's been living in the old Miller place. Got fresh laundry on the line. Maybe that pretty little bird Rourke saw in town? Kick it open, Dutch grunted. A massive boot slammed into the door. The old wood splintered, but the bolt held. Another kick, and the hinges shrieked. On the third blow, the door crashed inward in a cloud of dust. Dutch stepped through the frame, his Winchester rifle raised. Wyatt didn't hesitate. He stepped out from the shadows and leveled the Colt. "Drop it, Dutch," Wyatt said. His voice was no longer the raspy, weak tone of a wounded drifter. It was the icy, commanding resonance of the Wyoming cattle baron. Dutch froze. The color drained entirely from his sun-baked face. The rifle slipped from his trembling hands, clattering against the floorboards. Silas, stepping up behind him, let out a choked gasp. "Boss," Silas stammered, his eyes bulging as he looked at the man they had left for dead. "Mr. Callahan, Rourke said you was—" "Rourke talks too much," Wyatt said softly, stepping forward and disarming Silas with a swift, brutal strike to the wrist. "And you boys always were sloppy." Behind the hearth, Clara felt the air leave her lungs. The room began to spin. She stood up slowly, her hands clinging to the rough stone for support. She looked at the men cowering in fear, and then she looked at John. "Mr. Callahan?" Clara breathed, the name tasting like poison on her tongue. Wyatt flinched. He turned to look at her, the coldness vanishing from his eyes, replaced by a desperate, pleading vulnerability. "Clara, let me explain." "You're him," she interrupted, her voice trembling not with fear, but with a tidal wave of betrayal and righteous fury. "You are the man crushing this town. You are the tyrant, the monster." "I was," Wyatt said, taking a step toward her. "Clara, I was. But you saved me. You changed me." "Don't you dare," she hissed, tears of anger finally spilling over her lashes. "You lied to me for weeks. You ate the food I bought by pawning my mother's locket, while your men terrorized the man who sold it to me. You are a coward." Wyatt turned back to Silas and Dutch, his face hardening into a mask of pure, lethal resolve. "Get back to Bitter Creek," he snarled. "Tell Rourke I'm coming for him at sundown. Tell him to gather his men or run. If he's still in my town when the sun drops, I'll bury him under it." The two thugs scrambled out the door, leaping onto their horses and galloping desperately toward town. Wyatt dropped the gun on the table and looked at Clara. She was already dragging her battered leather trunk from the corner, throwing her few meager belongings into it. "I am leaving," she said, her voice shaking. "I will walk to the train station and wait 5 days if I have to, but I will not spend another minute with the devil." Wyatt moved to block the door. "Clara, please. You came west looking for a husband, a home. I own 100,000 acres. I own the bank, the lumber yard, the herds. I can give you the world." "I don't want a world built on the suffering of others, Mr. Callahan," she snapped, looking him dead in the eye. "And I certainly do not want you." Wyatt absorbed the blow. He nodded slowly, stepping aside. "You're right. I don't deserve you, but I am going to fix what I broke. Stay here until tomorrow. It isn't safe for you in town today. If I don't come back, the ranch, the money, it all goes to you. I wrote the will 3 days ago." Before she could process his words, Wyatt grabbed his duster, checked the cylinder of the Colt, and walked out into the blazing afternoon sun. Bitter Creek was a ghost town by 5 o'clock. Elias Cobb had locked the telegraph office, and Arthur O'Malley was hiding in the cellar of his general store. The only sound was the howling of the wind tearing through the wooden slats of the saloon, where Jedediah Rourke waited with 6 heavily armed men. Rourke was sweating profusely. He had spent years acting as Callahan's right hand, executing the boss's ruthless orders. He knew better than anyone the sheer unrelenting violence Wyatt Callahan was capable of. At exactly sundown, a lone figure appeared at the end of the dusty main street. Wyatt walked with a slight limp, his long canvas duster flapping in the wind. He didn't hide. He walked straight down the center of the avenue, a solitary titan returning to reclaim his throne. "Take him down!" Rourke screamed from the saloon balcony, wildly firing his revolver. Gunfire erupted, shattering the evening silence. Bullets kicked up geysers of dirt around Wyatt's boots and splintered the wooden boardwalks. But Wyatt didn't panic. He moved with cold, practiced efficiency. He dove behind a heavy water trough, returning fire. His first shot took out a man on the saloon roof. His second shattered the knee of a thug trying to flank him from the livery stable. The shootout was fierce but brief. Wyatt knew how these men thought because he had trained them. He used the town's layout to his advantage, moving from cover to cover, systematically dismantling Rourke's defenses. After 10 minutes of deafening gunfire, the street fell eerily quiet. 4 men were down, groaning in the dirt. 2 had dropped their weapons and run. Only Rourke remained, barricaded inside the saloon. Wyatt kicked the saloon doors open, stepping into the dim, smoke-filled room. Rourke leapt from behind the mahogany bar, firing wildly. A bullet grazed Wyatt's left shoulder, burning like a hot iron. But Wyatt didn't even flinch. He raised his Colt and fired a single, deafening shot. The bullet struck Rourke's gun hand, blowing the weapon away and sending the massive man crashing into a table of half-empty whiskey bottles. Wyatt walked over. The barrel of his smoking gun aimed directly at Rourke's forehead. Rourke whimpered, clutching his bleeding hand, expecting the execution he knew he deserved. "You're done, Jedediah," Wyatt said, his voice echoing in the empty saloon. "Get on a horse. Ride east. If I ever see your face in Wyoming again, I won't aim for your hand." Rourke scrambled out the back door like a beaten dog. Wyatt holstered his weapon. He was bleeding again, exhausted and in immense pain. But he wasn't finished. He walked across the street to the Bitter Creek bank. He kicked the door open, ignoring the terrified clerk, and walked straight to the heavy iron safe. Knowing the combination, he pulled out a thick stack of leather-bound ledgers. These books contained the predatory loans, the exorbitant land leases, and the crushing debts of everyone in town. Wyatt dragged the ledgers into the middle of the dirt street. He struck a match and tossed it onto the paper. Within minutes, a roaring bonfire illuminated the darkening sky. The townspeople slowly crept out of their hiding places, Elias Cobb, Arthur O'Malley, and dozens of others. They watched in stunned silence as the ruthless cattle baron burned his own fortune to ash. "The debts are forgiven," Wyatt announced loudly, his voice carrying over the crackle of the flames. "O'Malley, the store is yours, rent-free. Cobb, the town council, now owns the bank. Bitter Creek belongs to the people who built it." He didn't wait for their cheers or their confused thanks. He turned his back on the town and began the long, agonizing walk back to the Miller shack. It was nearly midnight when Wyatt stumbled through the shattered door of the cabin. He was pale, bleeding from his shoulder and completely drained. He expected the cabin to be empty. He expected his heart to finally break. But a fire was roaring in the hearth, and sitting beside it, a fresh roll of cotton bandages in her lap, was Clara Higgins. She looked up as he entered, her eyes taking in the blood and the exhaustion. She didn't look angry anymore. She just looked deeply, profoundly relieved. "I heard the gunfire," she said softly. "I thought you were dead." "I burned the ledgers," Wyatt rasped, leaning heavily against the doorframe. "I gave the town back. I let Rourke live. I don't know if I can be a good man, Clara. But I know I can't be the man I was. Not without you." Clara stood up, walking toward him. She reached out, her gentle fingers touching his soot-stained cheek. She saw the truth in his storm-gray eyes, not the ruthless cattle baron, but the man whose soul she had saved on this very floor. "Sit down, Wyatt," she whispered, using his real name for the first time. "You're bleeding on my clean floor, and we have a wedding to plan." In the end, Clara Higgins didn't just save a dying cowboy. She resurrected a man's soul. The forgotten mail-order bride became the matriarch of the Callahan Empire, transforming a legacy of ruthless greed into one of frontier justice and fierce compassion. Bitter Creek thrived, no longer living in fear, standing as a testament to the redeeming power of love forged in the unforgiving fires of the Wild West.